My name is Alina Marsh, and 11 months ago I stood in a rented banquet room at the Cedar Hollow Lodge, holding a glass of champagne I never got to drink, listening to my future mother-in-law tell 42 people that I was, and I'm quoting her directly, not who this family would have chosen. That was the first shock. The second one came about 90 seconds later when she looked directly at me and said she hoped I'd have the decency to give my son an exit before the invitations were non-refundable. There was a long, ugly silence. Somebody's fork hit a plate. My own mother's hand found mine under the table and gripped it so hard I felt her wedding ring dig into my knuckles. By midnight that same night, my fiancé, Caleb Whitfield, had packed 2 suitcases full of his mother's belongings, carried them to her car himself, and told her not to come back until she was ready to apologize to the woman he was going to marry. I need you to understand, Caleb doesn't do things like that. He's the kind of man who apologizes to furniture when he bumps into it. Watching him become someone else in the space of 4 hours, someone willing to choose me over the woman who raised him, should have felt like a victory. It didn't, because I had no idea yet that Deborah Whitfield's toast wasn't really about me at all. It was about money. A specific number, actually $340,000, and a signature on a loan document that Caleb had never signed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. Quick question, since we've got about an hour together, where are you tuned in from tonight, and is it late where you are, or are you one of those people who watches these on a lunch break? I always picture someone folding laundry or driving somewhere long and boring. Either way, I'm glad you're here because this story took me the better part of a year to live through, and I've never told it start to finish before. I'm 30 years old. I work as a physical therapist at a sports medicine clinic outside Grand Rapids, Michigan. I met Caleb 3 years ago when he tore his ACL playing rec league basketball and got assigned to my rehab schedule twice a week for 4 months. He brought me coffee before every single session, which I later learned he'd been doing since week 2, not because he needed to, but because he liked finding a reason to talk to me before the actual appointment started. Caleb's family runs a business called Whitfield Gardens, an event and wedding venue about 20 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with a restored 1920s barn, string lights, and a waiting list that stretches 18 months out. Caleb's father, Richard, built it from almost nothing over 3 decades. He passed away 4 years ago before I ever met the family, from a heart attack in the parking lot of that same venue. After Richard died, the business passed into a trust. Caleb, at 28, became co-trustee alongside his mother, Deborah, who had managed the books and the bookings for as long as the venue existed. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. Richards will specified that once Caleb turned 32, or married, whichever came first, full trusteeship would transfer to him, with Deborah stepping into an advisory role. I didn't know any of that in detail when Deborah started, very politely at first, asking pointed questions about my background, where my parents worked, whether I had student loans, whether physical therapists made steady money or if it fluctuated. I thought she was just protective. Mothers get protective. I told myself that for almost 2 years. I was wrong about what she was protecting. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be simple. 42 people, a private room at Cedar Hollow Lodge, a slideshow my sister put together, toasts from both sets of parents. My father went first. He told a story about the first time Caleb came to our house for dinner and helped my mother do dishes without being asked. And everyone laughed, and it was warm and easy, and I remember thinking, this is exactly how tonight is supposed to feel. Then Deborah stood up. She started fine. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about Richard, about how he would have loved seeing Caleb settle down. People were nodding, smiling. Then her tone changed, so subtly at first that I almost didn't catch it. Marriage, she said, is supposed to be a joining of 2 families who understand each other, who share the same values about what it means to build something and protect it. She looked at me then, not warmly. I've watched my son fall in love with someone who, I think, sees this family's success and mistakes it for something she's entitled to share in, simply by association. The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone realizes something is happening that shouldn't be. She kept going. She said I was not who this family would have chosen. She said something about how some people marry into stability because they've never had to build it themselves. And then came the line that ended the toast entirely. She looked at me, raised her glass slightly like this was somehow still a celebration, and said she hoped I'd have the decency to give my son an exit before the invitations were non-refundable. My mother's hand found mine under the table. Caleb stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. "Mom, that's enough." Deborah didn't sit down. She said evenly, like she'd rehearsed it, "Someone in this family needs to be honest before it's too late to matter." I remember staring at the tablecloth. I remember thinking, very clearly and very stupidly, that I had picked out that tablecloth color myself, sage green, and that I would never be able to look at sage green again without feeling this exact feeling in my chest. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't know for another 6 weeks, was that before it's too late to matter wasn't just cruelty for its own sake. Deborah had a very specific deadline in mind. And it had nothing to do with whether I was good enough for her son. Caleb walked his mother out of the banquet room himself. I stayed inside, surrounded by 42 people trying very hard to pretend they hadn't just watched what they'd watched. While my best friend Priya poured me a glass of water I didn't ask for, and my father sat very still with his jaw locked in a way I recognized from when he was trying not to say something he'd regret. Caleb came back 40 minutes later. His face was pale in a way I'd never seen. He asked everyone to give us a minute, and when the room cleared, he knelt down in front of my chair, not romantically, more like a man trying to keep himself upright, and said, "I don't know what's going on with her, but I promise you I am not choosing her over you. Not tonight, not ever. I want to be honest with you. I didn't fully believe him in that moment, not because I doubted his love. I doubted whether love was going to be enough to override 31 years of a mother who had clearly decided, for reasons I didn't understand yet, that I was a threat. I found out how much he meant it later that night. Deborah, along with Caleb's aunt and a few out-of-town relatives, was staying at a rental house Caleb had booked near the venue for the wedding weekend. Around 11:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Caleb. "Can you come to the rental? I need you to see this." When I got there, Deborah's suitcase, packed, zipped, sitting by the front door like an eviction notice, told me most of what I needed to know before anyone said a word. Caleb told me he'd gone to talk to her to try to understand what had happened, and instead of an explanation, he got more of the same. She told him I'd already gotten what I wanted out of this family and that he was too naive to see it. He asked her, point blank, what exactly it was she thought I wanted. She wouldn't answer. She just repeated that he'd understand eventually, and that he'd thank her. That was when Caleb walked into the guest room, packed her bag himself, folding her cardigans with the same careful, deliberate motions I'd watched him use on hospital corners when he made our bed, and told her she needed to go stay somewhere else until she was ready to apologize to me directly. She left without raising her voice again. She just looked at me on her way out the door and said very quietly, "You'll wish you'd let this go, Alina." I didn't understand what that meant, not for 6 more weeks. Quick gut check: if you were me, standing in that doorway at midnight the night before your rehearsal dinner disaster, would you have called off the wedding or pushed forward? Drop your answer in the comments, because by the end of this, I want to know if you'd have made the same choice I did. The wedding happened 4 days later, smaller than planned. Deborah didn't attend, and neither did the 2 relatives who'd sided with her, but it happened, and it was, against every odd, one of the best days of my life. Caleb cried during his vows. My father walked me down an aisle strung with the same sage green ribbon Deborah had mocked. I want you to hold onto that image because it matters later. It was during the reception cleanup, 2 days after the wedding, back at the rental house collecting leftover decor, that I found the first thread that would eventually unravel everything. Caleb was loading boxes into his truck. I was folding table linens in the living room when I noticed a manila folder wedged between the couch cushions. Deborah must have left it behind in the chaos of packing that night. I almost didn't open it. I want to be honest about that. Some small, tired part of me wanted to just throw it away and never think about Deborah Whitfield again. Instead, I opened it. Inside was a printed loan statement from a private lending company called Ferris Capital Partners, dated 4 months earlier. The loan amount was $340,000. The collateral listed was the commercial property at 4410 Birchwood Lane, Whitfield Gardens, and at the bottom, in the signature line for co-trustee authorization, was Caleb's name. I stared at that signature for a long time. Something about it looked slightly off. The C in Caleb curved differently than his usual handwriting, more rounded, less rushed. I'd watched Caleb sign hundreds of receipt slips and rehab intake forms over 3 years. I knew his signature the way you know a voice on the phone. I didn't say anything to him that night. I told myself I was probably wrong, that I was looking for reasons to distrust a woman who'd already given me plenty on her own, and that maybe I should just let it go, exactly like she'd warned me to. But 2 nights later I asked him directly, "Did you sign a loan document with Ferris Capital Partners back in March?" Caleb looked at me like I'd asked him if he'd flown to the moon. "I've never heard of Ferris Capital Partners in my life," he said. That was the moment the story stopped being about a bad toast at a rehearsal dinner. Here's something I should explain because it matters for everything that comes after. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a forensic accountant, but I am, professionally, someone who reads intake paperwork and insurance documentation for a living, which means I have a fairly high tolerance for dense financial language most people skim past. Caleb, understandably shaken, asked me if I'd be willing to sit down with him and go through the Whitfield Gardens books properly. Something he'd honestly been putting off for years, partly out of grief over his father, partly because his mother had always handled the money side, and he'd never had a reason to question it. We started on a Sunday afternoon at their kitchen table, 3 ring binders and a laptop between us. What we found in the first hour was ordinary: vendor invoices, seasonal booking patterns, the kind of small operational debt any small business carries. What we found in the second hour was the loan. The $340,000 from Ferris Capital Partners had been drawn against the business's equity in March, 6 months before our wedding. According to the trust documents Caleb's father had set up, any loan over $50,000 secured against the property required signatures from both co-trustees, Caleb and Deborah. Caleb's signature was there. He insisted, calmly at first and then less calmly, that it wasn't his. We pulled bank statements next. The $340,000 had been deposited into a Whitfield Gardens operating account, and then, over the following 11 weeks, transferred out in 6 separate withdrawals to a personal checking account in Deborah's name. Not the business account, hers. "Maybe it's for renovations," Caleb said, more to himself than to me. "The barn roof," she mentioned the barn roof needed work. I didn't argue with him. I understood in that moment that he needed a version of this that didn't require him to believe his mother had forged his signature and quietly drained $350,000 out of his late father's business. We'd find out the truth about the barn roof 3 weeks later. Spoiler, there was no work done on the barn roof. Forged signatures on documents that size don't usually get past a bank without a notarization. Sure enough, at the bottom of the loan authorization page there was a notary seal and a signature. Patricia Nuns, Notary Public, State of Michigan. Caleb recognized the name immediately. Patricia Nuns had been friends with his mother for over 15 years. She'd done the flowers for his parents' own wedding decades earlier, back before she became a notary at a local title company. She and Deborah played in the same weekly bridge group. We debated for 2 days whether to confront Patricia directly or go to an attorney first. In the end, Caleb's college roommate, now a real estate attorney named Marcus Yude, agreed to meet with us informally before we did anything official. Marcus was blunt. "Notarizing a signature you did not personally witness is not just an ethics violation. It's a crime in Michigan, potentially fraud, potentially loss of her notary commission, potentially worse if she'd known the signature was forged. If she notarized it without Caleb present," Marcus said, "either she was careless or she was complicit. There's a difference, but only one of those options doesn't put her at real legal risk." We requested a copy of Patricia's notary journal, a legal requirement in Michigan for every notarization performed. It took 2 weeks and a formal written request through Marcus's office before the title company where she worked produced it. The entry for the Ferris Capital loan document was there. The listed method of identification for Caleb Whitfield was a driver's license number that, when Marcus cross-referenced it through public record request, didn't match Caleb's license at all. It matched no one. The number was fabricated. Patricia Nuns had notarized a signature for a person who was never in the room, using an ID number that didn't exist. We didn't ambush her. Marcus insisted on doing this the right way, a formal letter first, requesting a meeting, informing her that discrepancies had been found in her notary journal, and that we intended to file a complaint with the state notary licensing division unless she was willing to explain herself. She agreed to meet us at Marcus's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. She looked, frankly, terrified before anyone said a word. She admitted it almost immediately. Deborah had called her in March, panicked, saying she needed a document notarized quickly and that Caleb was traveling for work and couldn't get to the office in time, and asked Patricia, as a friend, to just backdate the notarization once Caleb signed it later. He never signed it. Deborah had signed his name herself on the counter of Patricia's own kitchen, while Patricia watched, uncomfortable but unwilling to say no to a woman she'd known for 15 years. She told me it was a formality, Patricia said, her voice shaking. She said the loan was to cover a temporary cash gap and that Caleb already knew about it and just didn't have time to come sign it himself. I believed her. I shouldn't have, I know that now. Caleb sat very still through all of this. I watched something in his face close quietly, like a door being shut without being slammed. Patricia agreed to submit a written statement to the state notary board acknowledging the improper notarization and to cooperate with whatever legal action followed. Her cooperation would matter enormously later. It turned a he said, she said situation into something with actual documentary weight. But it still didn't answer the question underneath everything. Why did Deborah need $340,000 badly enough to forge her own son's signature? That answer came from an unlikely source. Caleb's Aunt Renee, Richard's younger sister, one of the relatives who'd sided with Deborah at the rehearsal dinner and stayed away from our wedding. Renee called Caleb in November, her voice tight, and said she needed to tell him something she'd been sitting on for months, something that had been eating at her since the wedding. Deborah had a gambling problem. Online sports betting, specifically something that had started small, Renee said, maybe 18 months after Richard's death, as a way to cope with the loneliness of running the venue without him. It escalated. By the time of our engagement, Deborah owed nearly $280,000 across 3 different platforms and 2 high-interest personal loans she'd taken out under her own name, loans she was defaulting on. She told me she had a plan, Renee said. She said once you and Alina got married, control of the trust would transfer to you fully, and she was terrified that once you took over the books, you'd find everything and she'd lose the business, lose her house, lose everything. She said she needed one more loan to cover the gap before the wedding happened. I told her not to do it. I didn't know she'd do this. Caleb asked the question I was thinking. Why did she attack Alina at the rehearsal dinner then? If she needed the wedding to happen quietly, why blow it up in front of everyone? Renee was quiet for a moment. Because Alina's a details person, Caleb. Deborah was terrified that once you two were officially married and Alina had reason to look closely at the business, which she knew you'd eventually ask Alina to help with, because Alina's good with numbers, she'd find the loan before Deborah could pay it back quietly. She thought if she could convince you the marriage was a mistake, even at the last minute she'd buy herself more time. She wasn't trying to save you from Alina, she was trying to save herself from getting caught. I sat with that for a long time after the call ended. Every cruel word at that rehearsal dinner, the comments about entitlement, about not belonging, about giving Caleb an exit before it was too late to matter, none of it had ever been about me at all. It had been about a deadline. A closing window before her son's new wife started asking questions she couldn't afford to answer. With Renee's account, Patricia's written statement, the falsified notary journal entry, and the bank statements showing the money moving into Deborah's personal account, Marcus told us we had more than enough to act. But he was careful to walk us through exactly what acting would mean. We had 3 separate but related problems to solve. First, the $340,000 loan itself, which was accruing interest against a business Caleb now legally controlled outright as sole trustee. Second, Deborah's ongoing role on paper as an advisory party to the trust, which under the original trust language couldn't simply be revoked without formal action. Third, whether to pursue this as a civil matter, a criminal matter, or try to resolve it privately within the family. Marcus was honest with us. You have grounds to report this as fraud. Forged signature, fraudulent notarization, misappropriation of trust assets. A prosecutor could absolutely build a case. But you should think hard about what outcome you actually want. A criminal case could mean real consequences for your mother. It could also mean this drags on for years and costs you both more than the money already lost. Caleb didn't answer right away. I remember him staring out the window of Marcus's office for what felt like a full minute before he said, quietly, I don't want my mother in prison. I want her to lose the power to ever do this again. And I want the business saved. We settled after several more meetings on a civil path, a formal petition to the county probate court to remove Deborah entirely from any role connected to the trust, combined with a demand for restitution structured as a repayment plan secured against her personal assets, including the house she still lived in, which Richard had left to her outright, separate from the business. It wasn't vengeance, exactly. It was closer to a fence being built where one should have existed years earlier. Deborah was served with the probate petition on a Thursday in December, 5 weeks before Christmas. She called Caleb 4 times that day. He didn't answer any of them until the evening when he called her back and asked her to meet him, not at the rental house, not at the venue, but at a coffee shop, neutral ground, with me present. She looked smaller than I remembered her. Not physically, she was exactly the same sharp, composed woman from the rehearsal dinner, dressed carefully even for this, but something about the posture of a person who knows they've run out of angles. She tried denial first. She said the petition was an overreaction, that whatever mistakes she'd made had been to protect the business, that she'd always intended to pay the loan back before anyone noticed. Caleb set the notary journal copy on the table between them, then Patricia's signed statement. Then the bank transfer records showing the money moving to accounts tied to the betting platforms Renee had named. "You forged my signature, Mom," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It was worse than loud, it was flat, exhausted. "You had a woman who's known you for 15 years lie for you. And then you stood up at my rehearsal dinner and told the woman I love she didn't deserve to be part of this family, while you were the one stealing from it." Deborah didn't cry, not at first. She said quietly, "I was going to lose everything, Caleb, the house, the business, your father's legacy, all of it. I panicked." "Then you should have told me," he said. "Instead you tried to convince me not to marry the person I love so I wouldn't have a wife smart enough to catch you." That was, I think, the moment it actually landed for her, not the legal exposure, not the money, but the fact that her son now understood, completely and permanently, what she'd been willing to do to protect herself. She cried after that. I won't pretend I didn't feel something looking at her, not quite sympathy, but something adjacent to it. People rarely become villains all at once. They usually arrive there one bad decision at a time, each one justified by the last, until they've built something they can't find their way out of. That doesn't erase what she did, but it explained it in a way that made the whole thing feel less like a cartoon and more like a genuinely sad human failure. Before I tell you how this actually resolved, I want to ask you something, because I've thought about this a lot over the last several months. If you found out someone in your family had done something like this, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of fear and desperation, would that change how you thought they should be held accountable? Or does the why not matter once the damage is done? I read every comment on these, so tell me where you land. The probate court process took just over 4 months. Deborah, through her own attorney, ultimately did not contest the removal petition. Patricia's statement and the falsified notary journal made the forgery essentially undeniable, and contesting it publicly would have meant a criminal referral neither she nor Caleb wanted. The final order, entered in March, removed Deborah permanently from any trustee or advisory role connected to Whitfield Gardens. Caleb became sole trustee, exactly as his father's original will had intended once he married. The restitution agreement required Deborah to repay the full $340,000 over 7 years, secured by a lien against the house Richard had left her. She sold the house 8 months later, unable to keep up with both the lien and her existing debts, and moved into a smaller condo 40 minutes away. The full amount was repaid roughly 2 years ahead of the original schedule, once the house sale went through, money the business genuinely needed, and finally got back. Patricia Nuns voluntarily surrendered her notary commission before the state board could revoke it. She sent me a card, months later, that I still haven't fully decided how I feel about. It said she was sorry, that she should have protected Caleb instead of protecting a friendship built on decades of not asking hard questions. We never pursued criminal charges. Caleb made that decision and I supported it, though I won't pretend some part of me didn't think she deserved more than a repayment plan and a smaller condo. But it wasn't my call to make, not really. It was his mother. I wish I could tell you that a year later everything healed. It didn't, not completely, and I think that's a more honest ending than the alternative. Deborah and Caleb speak now, occasionally, a phone call every few weeks, a stilted lunch every couple of months. She's never once in my presence said the words "I'm sorry" directly to me, She said them to Caleb once in that coffee shop in a general, glancing way, not to me. I've made a kind of peace with that. Some people don't have it in them to apologize to the specific person they wronged, only to the people whose good opinion they still need. Whitfield Gardens is fully solvent again. Caleb runs it now with a business manager he hired that summer, someone with no family ties, no complicated loyalties, just spreadsheets and quarterly reports. I help out during peak wedding season, mostly with vendor logistics, and every single time I walk that property, I think about the sage green ribbon on our own wedding day, 4 days after the worst night of my life, and how close we came to letting one toast define everything that came after. Renee and I talk more than I ever expected to. She apologized more than once for staying quiet as long as she did. I believe her when she says the guilt of that silence is part of what finally made her call. I don't know if Deborah has fully reckoned with what she did, or if she's just quietly aware that she got away with far less consequence than she could have. I don't need to know that in the end. I only need to know that she no longer has the power to do it again to anyone. Looking back now, almost a year removed from that rehearsal dinner, I don't think the lesson here is that Deborah was some uniquely evil person. I think the lesson is smaller, and honestly a little sadder than that. That fear, left alone long enough with no one to answer to, will make people do things they'd never have believed themselves capable of. She wasn't protecting her son from me that night. She was protecting herself from being seen clearly by anyone for the first time in years. What I'm proudest of isn't the paperwork, or the repayment plan, or even the moment Caleb carried those suitcases out to her car. It's that when it mattered, not in the heat of a humiliating toast, but months later at a kitchen table with 3 binders and a laptop between us, Caleb chose to actually look. Most people, I think, would have found a reason to look away. If there's a takeaway here, I think it's this. The people who love you well aren't the ones who never have to choose between you and someone else. They're the ones who choose and keep choosing, even after the anger fades and all that's left is the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding something that got broken. I still don't love the color sage green as much as I used to. But I'm working on that too. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. Takeaway. The people worth marrying aren't the ones with perfect families. They're the ones willing to see their own family clearly, even when it costs them.